All right, hello, ladies and gentlemen. So in today's presentation, we are going into a little bit of detail around progressive overload for hikers, which is an incredibly important subject for any hiker who's wanting to get the best out of their strength development to best help them on the trail. So to start with, let's do a quick little introduction on what progressive overload and what strength training is all about for hiking. Now, strength training ultimately is one of the most beneficial things a hiker can do to help them on the trail. And if you follow my stuff for a while, you know I talk about this all the time. Now, if done right, basically strength training can be really effective at reducing the risk of pain and injury both on and off the trail. So hikers struggle with foot pain, knee pain, back pain, shin pain, ankle pain, such common things in the world of hiking. And strength training, if done right, is one of the most significant things you can do to reduce the risk of these. Strength training can make elevation gain and loss much easier, going up and down steep ascents much easier. It can make pack carrying much more comfortable, whether it's a day pack or a full pack. It can improve your hiking speed. It can reduce fatigue and improve your movement efficiency. So every single step you take uses less and less energy. So it is really valuable for so many hikers out there. And I personally believe that every single hiker, no matter what type of hiking they're doing and what type of history or experience they have, should be doing some type of strength training. It's just so beneficial. Not to mention all the benefits we get out of our just everyday and general health on top of that. Now, however, as much as I talk about this all the time, and I talk to hikers about this all the time, I know there are many hikers out there who are aware that, look, these are some really good benefits to have, and they're trying to apply strength training into their week, but they're not really getting the best results possible from it. And there are some certain things holding them back from really getting the best results, which will best help them on the trail. And one of the major reasons for this, it's not the only reason, but one of the major reasons is essentially not either understanding or correctly applying this concept of progressive overload, which we're going to be exploring today. So today we're really going to dive into this subject, covered in quite a bit of detail, and explain why it is so important and how you can best put this into action, which will ultimately help you on the trail. So basically, let's go over the theory of progressive overload. It's pretty straightforward. Essentially, when it comes down to it, the body likes to be comfortable there. It basically, in every situation, the body has certain things that it's comfortable with, and it likes to be comfortable, basically. And ultimately, it doesn't like to be uncomfortable, in a nutshell. Now, basically, when we're looking in through the training context and we're looking through the context of exercise, is when the body has a certain type of stress applied to it, which makes it uncomfortable. It gets it out of this level where it's happy and it makes it a little bit uncomfortable. So in the training context, this is like doing an exercise, like a few squats, or maybe a full workout or whatever it may be. Essentially, when that stress is applied to it and the body gets uncomfortable, what will happen is the body will be like, hey, I didn't really like that. That was a little bit uncomfortable. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to change. I'm going to adapt. I'm going to create certain things in the body to help me better handle this stress in the future. So in this example, we get stronger. So ultimately, next time we're faced with this type of stress, the body won't be quite as uncomfortable, which is great. That's kind of the body's just adaptation process to stress. But the tricky thing here is when it comes down to it, is that'll kind of make sense for a lot of people. But the tricky thing with this is when it comes in our training, if we ultimately just keep on applying that original stress to the body and just doing the same exercise or the same workout again and again with no change, the body, even though it adapted the first time, even though it was stressful the first time, moving forward after it's adapted, it won't really have any reason to change again. It won't have any reason to improve. It won't have any reason to get stronger. And ultimately, it's just going to stay the same. On the flip side, if we apply new stress and apply a harder exercise or workout, it'll be forced to adapt again. And essentially, this is the idea of progressive overload, where we just basically progressively add more challenge in a way that is gradual and consistent, so we can continually add extra stress to the body and keep it adapting, keep it getting stronger. That's essentially training in a nutshell. Very simple concept, but a lot of people do miss it. Now, unfortunately, when it comes down to strength training, a lot of hikers out there, and just people in the general world of fitness who participate in strength training, do not quite get this principle right. A lot of people kind of understand that as a theory, and a lot of people think, well, that's pretty much common sense. But when it actually comes to applying this in their training, they don't quite get this right, which basically will lead to either getting subpar results, meaning for the time and effort that you are actually investing in your training, you're not quite getting the results that you could. Or a lot of people will just end up stagnation. They'll just kind of constantly be training and they'll just maintain a level of fitness and strength, which isn't a bad thing. But if you are wanting to improve, this is not so great. So typically in the world of hiking, I kind of see this in kind of three big situations, which if you're watching this, this may potentially apply to you. So I want to cover them because they are, pretty worthwhile highlighting. Now, situation number one, which is super, super, super common, is the idea of like HIIT sessions, group exercise sessions, online classes, where basically you're kind of doing a session, which is sort of like everyone's doing the same session, or it's a pre-made session or something like that, and you're going out and doing these types of workouts. Now, these types of sessions, for the most part, can be great for just staying generally fit. HIIT sessions, you get really, really sweaty for 30 minutes, 45 minutes, something like that. Really, really push yourself. It's great for just general fitness. And if we're in the situation where we're just kind of wanting to stay generally fit and stay generally healthy, these things can be pretty good. However, when it comes to these types of classes and these types of sessions, it is very, very, very rare that there is any type of long-term plan with these sessions. Because ultimately the way these sessions are designed, whether it's group exercise, things like pump or Pilates sessions or yoga sessions, online classes, HIIT sessions, CrossFit, whatever it may be, usually they're kind of just designed as a standalone workout. Meaning you get a really good workout in at that moment, but then the next workout you do, typically it doesn't really sort of build off the previous one. And it's just kind of workouts in isolation, which kind of fits this model where people kind of drop in and drop out of sessions, pretty well. But basically what this leads to is you can work really, really hard and feel great from these workouts, but because there is not much thought to this principle of progressive overload, there's not much thought or capacity to have this structured progression over time, this can significantly impact your progress and significantly reduce the amount of strength, the amount of resilience, and the amount of endurance you're building, even if you're working really, really, really hard, because this principle is so important. And if there's not room for it or there's not attention to it, you will be limited. Now, the second situation I often see this is with personal trainers. And I'll sort of say this applies to a lot of people out there. It doesn't apply to all personal trainers. I won't put everyone in a nutshell, but it is really, 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 really common in the fitness industry. And for me, before I even started working with the hikers, I fell into this quite a bit as well. I'm not saying I'm perfect, but like a lot of people do it. And I've seen this all around the world in all different gyms. And it's very, very common. So basically what tends to happen is when we're working with a personal trainer, you're working one-to-one sessions, the trainer doesn't really have a plan or doesn't really follow a program for their client. They're not really following pre-made sessions or having a long-term plan. Some people do, but probably for the majority of trainers out there, not so much. What they're doing instead is, again, just kind of making workouts out on the spot. And they'll end up having the client have a really good workout, which will make you feel good and you'll work hard, you'll walk out of the session feeling good, which is a great thing for a lot of people. But because these workouts, again, they don't have a bit of a long-term plan, if they're just changing exercises all the time, and they're not really sort of slowly building things up with intention, this progressive overload can be compromised. It's a really, really common thing. Now, you may be thinking about this and like, well, you know what? Personal trainers are professionals. I pay money to a personal trainer. And are you saying what I'm doing there is not so great or is wrong? Like, why does this happen? Pretty much realistically, the reason why this is so common in the world of fitness is the majority of the fitness industry, in all honesty, is geared towards two things, either weight loss or general fitness. Pretty much 95% of the fitness industry is geared toward those two things, which is fine. And ultimately for those two things, when it comes to weight loss and comes to general fitness, it doesn't really matter what you do, in all honesty. Like, yes, there are certain things you can do to make things a little bit better, a little bit more effective, but realistically, it doesn't really matter if you're improving your strength. It doesn't really matter if you're following progressive overload. It really just matters is that you're working hard, that you're having a good time, and that you're being consistent. It's pretty straightforward. But on the flip side, if you are actively wanting to improve your strength, improve your endurance, improve your resilience for a particular reason, so in our context, actually hiking, and we actually actively want to be improving to get better at hiking or improve an ache or pain or whatever it may be, we kind of want to be a little bit more intentional. We don't want to just fall into this trap of just doing random things, but we want to make sure we are doing this progressive overload so we are improving. And the final situation is kind of DIY trainers. So people are just sort of putting together their own workouts, either at training at home or in the gym. Like a lot of people will find a routine and they'll be like, hey, a trainer showed me this routine, or I found this off the internet, whatever it may be, or I put together something. I quite like this. And they'll end up just doing the same routine for weeks and weeks and months on end, and nothing really progresses. Really, really common. Or on the flip side, a lot of people, when they're doing it by themselves, they'll just change programs all the time. They'll see a different thing on the internet. They're like, I'm going to try this week, or this week, or this week. Or just do random exercises here and there and just walk in the gym. Like, today I'm going to do some leg press and then some squats and then this and this and this. And again, it never really has a plan. So we never really get a chance to apply progressive overload. So all of these situations, not ideal. They're not the end of the world. You will still have fun. You will still see some improvements, but we can do better. So basically, to combat these situations, today we're going to be exploring a range of different ways that you can progress your strength. So ultimately, if you are doing your own workouts, you'll be able to apply this to ensure that you are regularly moving forward. If you're working out with a trainer, you can kind of use this and just have a think about, okay, is this actually happening in my training sessions? And if not, then you can have a sort of conversation with your trainer and be like, hey, I love what we're doing, but I would love to sort of like really have a bit of a plan so I can progress and can get stronger. Or if they're not open to it, then, maybe having a change. If you're doing group exercise or, online classes, this is a little bit trickier to apply, admittedly. But it is good information to have either way. Now, ultimately, what I'm going to be talking about today is in the strength training context. So we're going to be specifically talking about strength training, but the concept of progressive overload is important for both your cardio and your hiking as well, in slightly different ways. So basically, when it comes down to this, it kind of applies to all your training, but we just want to sort of fit into it where we can. Now, essentially, when it comes down to this today, we're going to be talking about 5 different methods of progression which you can apply. These are really, really simple. These are effective, and pretty much any hiker can apply them. It doesn't really require a huge amount of knowledge. And we're going to be using the examples of one specific exercise, and we're just going to be talking about step-ups today. So step-ups, hiker's favorite, and we're just going to be using that example. I'm going to show you a bunch of different ways you can progress this one single exercise, but obviously you can apply this to any exercise you're doing. So first and foremost, let's talk about method progression number 1, manipulating repetitions. Now, repetitions, probably know it, but basically, this is just basically the amount of times you do an exercise before resting. So if you're doing step-ups, you might do 10 repetitions. Every time you do a step-up, that counts as 1 repetition. Now, essentially, when it comes down to the sort of general theory of training, the different amounts of repetitions you do of a certain exercise will target slightly different aspects of your strength development. So in a nutshell, if we're doing higher repetitions, if we're doing like 15, 20, 25, 30 repetitions of an exercise before we have to have a rest, this is kind of skewing a little bit more towards the muscular endurance side of things, which is essentially the ability of your muscles just to produce a moderate amount of force again and again and again and again and again and again. Now, on the flip side of things, if we're doing an exercise where we're kind of getting to 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 repetitions, and then we kind of need a rest, this is probably skewing a little bit more towards the strength side of things, which is more the maximal force that your muscles can produce. Now, I'm not going to go into too much, but one mistake a lot of hikers make with their strength training is they're like, hey, I really don't need strength. I just need endurance. So they just do this high repetition stuff. But without going into too much detail, both of these incredibly valuable for hikers. So ultimately get the best out of your training. We kind of will get exposures to both. Now, this idea around manipulating repetitions is basically just taking a single exercise that you're doing, in our context, step-ups, and just manipulating the amount of reps you do on an exercise over time. Now, essentially what this will do is it will change the stimulus to the body, because there will be different stimulus from doing lower repetition of an exercise or higher repetitions, and it will force the body to have that new stress and cause it to adapt and improve. So to give you some, example context of how this works, take, for example, we're doing step-ups. You're going to do a phase of training, and when I'm going to be saying phases of training through the rest of the presentation, I'm just going to be meaning 4 weeks of training at a time, which is going to be our phase of training. You're going to do your step-ups for 4 weeks at a certain number of repetitions. So you'll do, in this example, let's say you do 10 repetitions of step-ups for 4 weeks. So each week, 10 repetitions, 10 repetitions, 10 repetitions. Now, each week you do this over this 4-week period, you're going to try and add a little extra weight. So week 1, you might do body weight. Week 2, you might have 2 kilos. Week 3, 4 kilos, yada, yada, yada. Now, essentially, you'll do this for 4 weeks. Then the next 4-week training phase, you'll basically either look at your step-ups and you'll either want to increase or decrease the amount of repetitions you're doing. So in this example, you might say, okay, I've done 10 repetitions at a time for 4 weeks. So in the next 4-week block, I'm either going to do 15 repetitions at a time or 6 repetitions at a time. I'm either going to go a little bit more endurance-based or a little bit more strength-based. Now, essentially, the key to this is when you're looking at it is you will just have to adjust the amount of weight or resistance you do to reflect on this new rep range. So in the example, you've been doing 10 repetitions. Say you went up to 15 repetitions, you'll probably have to reduce the amount of weight you're doing and slowly build it up. Or if you go down to 6 repetitions, then you'll probably have to increase the amount of weight you're using, because we just need to adjust the weight to sort of reflect the amount we're doing. So an example of a 12-week plan here is if you were just doing this one exercise, you might do 4 weeks for 10 repetitions, then 4 weeks of 6 repetitions with a slightly heavier weight, and then 4 weeks of 15 repetitions with a slightly lighter weight. That's a perfectly legitimate 12-week plan. And as you can see, that's really, really simple, but that will keep you moving forward over that 12-week period. Very, very simple, but very, very effective. Now, one consideration with this is it can be very, very effective and very, very useful, but it can get a little bit boring, and sometimes, this can affect your consistency. Some people, if they're looking at the idea of doing the same exercise for 8 weeks or 12 weeks in a row, it can get a little bit boring. And if you feel like, you're going to fall out of your routine or consistency because of that, you may want to choose one of these other options instead, but can be very effective. Now, method of progression number 2 I want to talk about is manipulating range of motion. So essentially, range of motion is essentially just how far you're moving through an exercise. So if we're using the let's use the example of a step up. On a big range of motion, you might be using a really, really high box. On a small range of motion, you might be using a really, really low box. And basically, it just changes how far you're actually moving during an exercise. Now, essentially, adjusting that range of motion during an exercise can change the exercise significantly and can change the level of difficulty significantly. Ultimately, typically smaller ranges of motion, so when you're not actually moving quite far, typically ends up being a little bit easier. So if an exercise is easier, this gives you the option of adding extra weight and adding challenge in a different situation. Or larger range of motions ends up being a little bit more difficult. Very, very simple. So essentially just manipulating this and changing these different ranges of motions can be a really, really effective method of progression. So a few examples of this in regards to the step ups to give you some context. This example here is a typical normal step up. Basically someone's, going up and down on a box. That's kind of a normal sized box or whatever it may be. In this situation, we may be using a little bit of weight, on the back. Now, if you wanted to manipulate the range of motion, say you wanted to go a little bit higher, you could use a high box step up, where basically you've got a higher box. It's quite a bit further to go. You'll find it more difficult. And in this version, you'll find it more difficult. So maybe you just need to use body weight. And that's a nice progression. Or in the third example, if you wanted to go a little bit lower, you might do, like, for example, a low box step up. You may not be able to see this video quite well, but it's a very low box. It's like halfway up my shin. And in this example, it's way, way easier, but I can add in a huge amount of extra weight. So in this example, I've got 60 kilos on my back. So all of these are exactly the same exercise, but we can change the range of motion and change the amount of weight that we're using. And that's a perfectly legitimate way of progressing things. Now, basically, when it comes down to this, what you look at is basically you do a phase of training of an exercise for a certain number of reps. Each week you do it, you can basically add a little bit extra weight or, an extra rep or so. Now, at the end of the phase, so after the end of the 4 weeks, you're going to choose, I'm either going to increase or decrease the range of motion. I'm either going to go on a higher box or a lower box, or, if you're doing another exercise, a different situation. Now, if you increase the range of motion, essentially what you want to do is you either want to keep the same amount of weight or you want to decrease the weight if that's a little bit different. So what I mean by that is if you're going from a backpack step up to this high box step up, you would either try to, in the next phase, keep the same amount of weight you were doing on the backpack, but use the higher box. Or if you find that's a little bit difficult, then you may have to reduce the amount of weight to go to that body weight version, whatever you need to do, depending on how far you increase the box. If you decrease the range of motion, so if you make it shorter and technically easier, then you want to increase the range of motion. So you're still giving the body challenge. You're still not, still giving it something to adapt to, but we just apply a different load. So really, really simple. Now, a couple of considerations on this is if you do, this is really, really, really effective and you can use this quite well. But if you take it too far to each extreme, if you make it too big range of motion or too small range of motion, it can be a little bit counterproductive. So ultimately, if you end up having too large a range of motion, you can sometimes be limited with balance. So sometimes you're just wobbling all over the place and can't really work very hard. Or mobility. Sometimes you just can't actually get into positions very well. And that can be limiting, which we don't really want. Or alternatively, if you do too little range of motion, sometimes it can just be like too little and it's not even an exercise. So if you took a step up and you ended up just having a step which is like an inch high, may not really be too valuable for you, unless you put a crazy amount of weight on, which most people aren't going to be doing. The other thing as well is if you are increasing the range of motion and it's significantly, and say you're using a super high box, just ease yourself in initially, because sometimes when we're doing something that's a big step up in range of motion, the body's just working in different ways. And sometimes if we just jump up too quickly, it can just lead to aches and pains. So just ease yourself in with that type of thing. But that's method number 2. Now, before I go any further, I've got a few more methods I'm going to go through, but I fully understand if we're 20 minutes into this presentation and you might be like, okay, Rowan, this kind of sounds good, but in all honesty, I don't actually know what exercises I should be choosing. I don't actually know how to build out a workout. I don't actually know where I'm supposed to apply these ideas of progression. And if that's for you, then I do have something to kind of fill those gaps. If you were interested in this whole idea around strength training for hiking, I do have a free mini course around getting started with strength training for hiking. Now, inside the course, you'll basically learn a little bit more on the benefits of strength training for hiking. It'll talk through a few more of the principles of effective strength training. So we're talking about progression today, but there are other things that go into the context of this. And also it'll teach you how to actually put together your own strength workout. So how to choose exercises, how to structure a workout so you can make sure you're covering all your bases and really best helping your hiking. Now, if you did want to get access to that, it's absolutely free. All you have to do is go to summitstrength.com.au/strength-mini-course. That's summitstrength.com.au/strength-mini-course. You can get your hands on that course for free and take it from there. So with that being said, let's keep on moving forward into method of progression number 3, which are tempo and pauses. So essentially tempo is essentially the speed of your repetitions and how quick or slow you're doing a repetition. And essentially changing the speed of an exercise or adding pauses at certain stages of an exercise can significantly alter the difficulty of an exercise, and it can be a legitimate way of making things harder. Now, basically pauses. So if you're doing an exercise and halfway through a repetition or at a certain point of repetition, you have a pause and you just stop and hold that position for 1 to 2 seconds, then continue on. That can significantly make things a little bit more difficult. Same thing with going slower. Typically slower repetitions can make an exercise a little bit harder and really, really simple, but very, very effective. Now, on the flip side, if you do repetitions a little bit faster or more explosive, this in different contexts, it can be pretty effective, but in all honesty for hiking, it's not something that's super relevant. You may see things online where people talk about this, and it can be great in certain contexts, but for hikers, it's not something I really use, so we're not going to go into that too much detail. So to give you a couple of examples here, again, on the step up, this particular exercise is a paused step up. So basically you can see you've got a step up, you go a little bit, little pause, and then all the way up. And each repetition, you just have this little pause here. So the idea behind this is it just stops your momentum and stops you kind of, just pushing straight up, significantly make things more difficult. Or on this particular exercise, this is an eccentric step up, which essentially just slows down the lowering side of things. So basically on the way down, we're counting 3 or 4 seconds and going really, really slow on the way down, which again is a really effective way of making things a little bit more difficult. So basically how you can actually use this method of progression, basically you would do an exercise for a training phase. So again, 4 weeks, you just do the same exercise for 4 weeks. In the next training phase, you would basically you can keep that same exercise and basically either add a 1 to 3 pause at a slightly difficult spot. So somewhere along that repetition, just add a pause to take that momentum out. Or you can add an extra 1 to 3 seconds on the lowering portion. Typically, you don't have to slow down in the step up example, the pushing up portion, or the bit where you feel like you're really working, but it's more the returning to the start position or the lowering place where we want to slow things down. Now, either of those perfectly legitimate methods of progression make things more difficult and keep you moving forward. Now, a couple of considerations, probably don't do too many phases of this, because it does, it can be very, very beneficial, but it gets old pretty quickly. So I would sort of say only really do 1 phase of something and then just do 1 phase of this, like slightly changing the tempo of the pause. And then in the next phase, do some other method of progression. And then you can go back to pauses and tempos after that, but don't do too many phases of this in a row. And one thing to be considerate about is if you are doing super slow lowers, so say you're doing that eccentric step up version I talked about before, or doing a slow lower in another exercise, this can lead to a little bit more muscle soreness. So it's not unusual if you do this type of thing, and the next day or two you're like, oh, you know what, the legs are really sore, or whatever it may be. It's just a consequence of this slower stuff. It's not bad, but it's just something to be aware of. Now, also with this type of method of progression, you can actually use this like within training phases. And I quite like this actually within your training phases. So essentially, as I sort of said, a training phase, typically like 4 weeks. So within those 4 weeks, like as you're doing an exercise, you can add a little bit extra weight each week. And then your next training phase, change to something else. Now, in this situation, you could use these lowers within that little 4-week block. So each week you do an exercise, you could just add an extra second lowering. You wouldn't add weight in this situation, but you just add a little extra weight, a little extra second lowering. Really, really simple, but it can be a nice way of just making things a little bit harder week to week. It's another option for you. Now, method of progression number 4 is weight placement. Now, this is an interesting one, which a lot of people miss, but it can be really useful, particularly for people who may be a bit limited on equipment or training at home. So essentially changing where the weight is placed on your body. Or how you actually hold it. And so where your grip is positioned or whatever it may be can actually change an exercise enough to be considered a method of progression. Because typically what this does is if the weight is changed on your body and your body has to move slightly different, the body doesn't know it's the same exercise. It just thinks it's a new exercise. And that is a perfectly legitimate method of progression. So essentially when it comes down to this, in some exercises where you actually hold the weight and how you carry it or how you hold it can make things a little bit easier for you. So in that situation, you can actually add a bit more resistance and challenge yourself there. Or alternatively, some ways where you hold the weight in slightly different situations can just make things harder. Even though you're using the same amount of weight, it can actually make things harder. So it can go that way. Now, a few examples of this, really, really straightforward. Again, using the step up example. First example, something that a lot of people have done, just a dumbbell step up. So holding 2 dumbbells or 1 dumbbell at your side, stepping up and down, pretty straightforward. Now, the next one is a goblet step up. So basically, instead of holding the dumbbells at our side, we're holding the dumbbell at our chest and going up and down, up and down. Now, that will change the way the body works and it can make things a little bit harder and just change how the body's working, which is great. Then the third one is doing an overhead step up. So this version, we're holding a dumbbell straight above your head and we're going up and down like that. And we'll notice this is actually challenges the body in slightly different ways. So all of these exercises, they're all step ups. They're all using the same equipment. They're all using dumbbells, but the way we hold the weight is changing things. And we can use this as a method of progression. So essentially how we typically use this is you would just do a phase 4 weeks again of holding a weight in one position, week after week after week, just trying to add a bit extra weight. Now, after that, in the next phase, you just adjust the weight position and you go from, in this example, you might do 4 weeks weight at your side, 4 weeks at your chest, 4 weeks overhead, and just rotate through that. And that works out pretty well. Very, very simple. Now, this can be a really good option for people who are training at home with limited equipment, because some people are at home and they've only got 2 or 3 dumbbells, so they don't have the option of just manipulating reps so much or doing one of the other things. So this can be a really good option. And as you get stronger, you just use harder and harder placements to give the body extra challenge there. You can also use this like same idea, apply it to different types of weight as well. So it's not just taking one weight and changing how you actually hold it, but changing from dumbbells to barbells is another method of progression. Changing to a backpack, changing to a weight vest, changing to even water jugs or a dry bag full of water. All of these things are just different ways the weight are held in the body, and that will affect the body how it moves, and they can be different ways of changing up that exercise and keeping you moving forward. So a few ideas on that. Now, one thing I do want to highlight before I go any further is a note on changing your training surface, which is a really, really common thing in the world of hiking. So many people in the hiking world, you see this on social media all the time, where people are like, hey, you're training for a hike. What we should be doing is taking an exercise and using unstable or strange surfaces as a method of taking an exercise and making it a little bit harder. So what I mean by that is using things like stability discs, which are those little flat discs, which are really, really wobbly, or a Bosu ball, which is this thing in the top right-hand corner, that kind of wobbly ball, or doing things like floating heel training, where you basically, got 1 foot, like half your foot on a surface and half a foot actually floating in the air. And a lot of people will use these instead of say, hey, if you've been doing lunges for a while, if you've been doing step-ups for a while, let's try this. You'll do this exercise on one of these things and it'll feel really, really hard. And the idea behind this is because the hiking requires you to sort of be in different positions with your feet because we're looking at rough surfaces and that. The idea is that people will say, hey, this is going to be more specific to your hiking. And that's what gets touted online a lot. Now, in all honesty, when it comes down to this, this type of training, this unstable surface or strange surface training, in all honesty, is not a great method of progression for hikers. I want to mention it because a lot of people will be like, hey, you know what, maybe I'll do this, but it's not probably the best option. Now, the reason why I say that is, in all honesty, this type of thing, it limits your force production. And essentially what it does is, because we're on this unstable surface, it limits how much we can actually push ourselves during these exercises. And essentially what it ends up doing, as opposed to these exercises working the quadriceps and the glutes and the hamstrings to a degree that they'll improve, we'll actually basically just turn all of these exercises into balance or foot or ankle exercises, and they'll become the main focus. And those other areas probably won't get enough challenge to improve. They'll still get some challenge. I'm not saying it's night and day, but it's probably not enough challenge to really, really get the best benefits out of this. And it ends up being a bit of a trap, because we just turn everything into balance exercises or foot exercises and don't actually get the best benefits from actually working all these other muscles. Now, there's nothing wrong with using these types of exercises as part of your broader training context. And if you're specifically trying to do balance or foot or ankle exercises, and specifically trying to target something, you can use these things. I'm not saying don't, but what I typically recommend is, when we're looking at our training, separate your strength building exercises and your balance or your prehab exercises. So don't try to combine everything together, because it ends up just being like, not very effective, but separate them out. Do your strength ones, use these methods of progression I'm talking about here. And if you want to do this unstable stuff or the strange surface stuff, use that as slightly different exercises. So I just want to cover that because it's really, really relevant in the world of hiking. Now, the next method of progression is one that I use for my hikers loads, and particularly on our online programs, where sometimes people have limited equipment or limited experience in the gym. This is a really, really effective method. It's basically just changing exercises. So ultimately, when it comes down to it, there are many exercises out there which are different in nature. They're actually different exercises, but they still pretty much work the same muscles, in just slightly different ways. So for example of this is like step ups and lunges. Like, most hikers are familiar with these two things, step up and lunges. Basically, both of these exercises, they predominantly work the quadriceps and a little bit of the glutes. Both of these are single-legged exercises, and they're considered single-legged pushing exercises. They're pretty much the same, but they're just slightly different. Now, essentially, one method of progression that we can use is essentially doing our training and then progressing things by just choosing a new exercise which challenges the same muscles, but in a slightly different way. And this is a perfectly legitimate way of just applying new or different stimulus to these muscles. So a few examples here is basically we've got our lateral step up, which is another variation of doing a step up, working the quadriceps, bit of the glutes. We've got a pistol squat, or in this version, we've got an eccentric pistol squat, which is again working predominantly the quads, maybe a little bit of glutes in that. And we've got the bodyweight split squat, which again is predominantly working the quads, a little bit of the glutes. All of these exercises are working pretty much the same muscles, but as you can see, they're all a bit different. So essentially how we use this is really simple. You would do an exercise for a phase of training. In the next phase of training, you would just choose out another exercise which works the same muscle group. Really, really, really simple, but very, very effective. Now, considerations here is basically, remember, we do still need to make sure we are making things more difficult over time. So it's not just changing things for change's sake, but we're changing things to continually add challenge to the body. So essentially, if you are choosing an exercise which is harder, so if you're doing, say, step ups and then you go to split squats, and traditionally split squats feel quite a bit more difficult than a step up, this can be a good progression in itself. You'll do 4 weeks of step ups and 4 weeks of split squats. That works out pretty well. But if you're going the other way and say you're doing 4 weeks of split squats and then you choose an exercise which is a bit easier, say it's a step up, and we're like, oh, this exercise actually feels really easy, then essentially we still want to add more challenge. So in this situation, we want to load it up a little bit. So you might go from bodyweight split squats to dumbbell step ups and just make sure it's a little bit more difficult in one way or another. So if something is harder, that's a perfectly legitimate method of progression. If something is easier, then we want to make it harder in one way or another. Just remember that. And then on top of that is just make sure the exercises you are doing is actually choosing and working the same muscle groups and movements. And that's something a lot of people kind of fall into the trap of. For example, I've seen people in the past do things like do a phase of step ups and then they'll do a phase of like single-legged deadlifts. Now, single-legged deadlifts are a great exercise, but it works different muscles differently. It works different muscles. It's not really the same thing. So basically just want to make sure you are still doing an exercise which works the same muscle group if you're using this method of progression. Now, there are they're kind of 5 methods I really like, and I think they're very, very simple, very, very easy to apply. And you can basically just, if you wanted, you could rotate between these 5 pretty much indefinitely and continually see some really good results. Now, when it comes down to training, there are so many other methods of progression out there, and they're dozens and dozens and dozens of other ways you can go about this. Those 5, I think they're really simple, really effective. They don't really require equipment. They don't really require knowledge. They don't require advanced training experience or anything like that. But I just want to briefly touch on a few others which I haven't included and why. One that often gets used, and it's perfectly legitimate, is adding volume. So basically what you would do is just add an extra set each week or each training phase. So for example, you may spend 4 weeks doing 3 sets of 10 step-ups. And then the next phase, you might do 4 sets of 10 step-ups. And the next phase, you might do 5 sets of 10 step-ups, and yada, yada, yada. Now, this works, but in all honesty, it can be pretty time-consuming. And I personally just like to keep my workout time consistent for my hikers. So we're just doing 30 minutes every single week, or 45 minutes every single week, or 60 minutes every single week, and change things up there. This works, but I don't use it a huge amount. Another one is manipulating rest periods. So basically, you may sort of do 4 weeks of doing 90 seconds rest in between an exercise, then 4 weeks doing 60 seconds rest, and then 4 weeks doing 2 minutes rest. But then the 2 minutes rest, because you're more rested, you can actually add extra weight, whatever it may be. Now, again, this is perfectly legitimate, but I'm not a massive fan of that. I prefer doing the other stuff. I think it's just a bit more effective. Doing things like explosive reps, so doing reps really, really, really quick, can be a good method, but it's not super relevant for the hiker's needs. Can be great for other sports and other activities, but for hikers, I don't think it's particularly necessary. And then using things like bands or chains, which a lot of people will see in the gym. They can be great, but again, it's not really necessary or accessible for most hikers. All of these things work if you know what you're doing and how to do it, and it works for you, but I haven't included them because, I don't think they're the best way of going about things for one reason or another, at least when we're talking in a general sense, like on this video. So a few final, like a little wrap up in regards to how to actually use these progressions. Really, really simple. You would choose an exercise that you want to do. You do that exercise for 4 weeks as part of a program. Each week you do it. Within those 4 weeks, you just try to add some extra weight or maybe add a repetition or 2 or something like that. After the 4 weeks, you would just choose one of these methods of progression. And then you just repeat 4 weeks, progress, 4 weeks, progress, 4 weeks, progress, 4 weeks, progress, and just keep on going like that. Now, in theory, if programmed right, you can probably keep on progressing with your exercises and with your strength, rotating between these things for years on end, in theory, to one degree or another. Like, yes, initially your strength gains will be very, very quick. And then as we get more experienced and have more, things get a little bit slower. But in theory, you can keep on doing this almost indefinitely. But in reality, the road is never this smooth. Life always does get in the way of our training. You'll get sick at some stage. You'll have a super stressful time. You'll have busy periods. You'll be low motivated, whatever it may be. Ultimately, when it comes down to the longer term process of this is if we are going through a bit of a tough period, we're not super energetic, we've got something getting in the way, you may realistically not be able to progress. It happens. And during these times, you may just want to be doing what you can to maintain things as best as you can. The goal may not be getting stronger, but it may be just making sure we don't lose too much strength while we're struggling. But then basically when life settles and you just basically want to begin the process again, you may have to pull things back. If you've been sick for 2 weeks, you may have to go back and make things a bit easier for yourself. So we then regress things as opposed to progress things and then slowly build things up. Just be aware of that. So in theory, you can keep on building up pretty much indefinitely. In practice, obviously, it's a bit more up and down. And as you get more experienced, as you get stronger, it gets a little bit more difficult to keep on moving forward. So with that being said, hopefully this does give you a few insights in regards to how to apply progression into your strength training, which is such an important thing. But in all honesty, I fully understand if you're watching this and you're like, well, okay, cool, that makes sense, but I still don't really know how to put this into action for myself. I don't know which ones I should be choosing. I don't know what exercise I should be doing. I don't know how to put together these workouts. I don't know how to figure out my cardio, my hiking, because there's so many other pieces of the puzzle that goes into it. So if you were interested in getting a little bit extra help with all of this, I would love to chat with you. Now, essentially through Summit Strength, which is my online personal training service for hikers, we offer personalized training programs for hikers to help them get fit, strong, resilient for their adventures. Now, essentially what our online packages will do is we'll create a custom and personalized workout plan to help you get ready for anything the trail may throw at you, covering strength training, cardio, hiking, recovery, mobility, all designed in a way which is going to fit around your life, your needs, your goals, your preferences. And on top of that, make sure we are taking those steps again and again and again to keep you moving forward. Now, we also do put a big emphasis into education through our programs. We'll educate you on all the peripheral factors which can make or break an adventure. So things like nutrition, recovery, self-care, mental strength, pain prevention, a ton of other things which can play into the broader picture, and also give you the coaching, support, and accountability to keep you on track. Because as we said before, sickness, stress, time commitments, motivation, all of these things come up and get in the way of typical training programs. So we'll make sure we have someone in your corner to help you through these things and make sure you're continually moving forward, or at least have someone to help you out when you need. Now, if this does sound like you and you want to learn a little bit more, all you need to do is go to summitstrength.com.au/online. On there, there's a nice video which talks through our program, how it works, what's involved. And then if that does sound like something you'd want to go learn a little bit more about and see if it's right for you, there's a link on that page where you can book a call with our team. We can sit down, have a really thorough chat, find out about your situation, your needs, your goals. And if it sounds like something we can help with, we can sort of talk you through one of our packages which may fit into your situation. And you can make a decision if that's right for you. So if you did want to find out a little bit more, go to summitstrength.com.au/online and we can take it from there. So with that, I really do hope you've enjoyed today's episode, today's webinar. I hope this sort of fills in a few gaps for a lot of people with their strength training, and hopefully you can apply some of these methods and it can keep you getting strong and ultimately make you feel great on the trail. So thank you so much for listening. I hope you've enjoyed today, and we'll talk to you soon. Bye.